take 500. Hi, this is Christy Simmons Olson, and this is my final presentation for U.S. History 1. For this class, I happened to be looking into my own family genealogy at the same time while we were studying, and I noticed that there was kind of a correlation between some of my ancestors and what we were looking at. And I pretty much got obsessed, and I started digging further into my ancestors' histories and finding birth certificates, death certificates, censuses, just wills, pretty much anything I could find to kind of tell their stories. And I found some really amazing stories in my family history. So most of my family branches all went back before the Revolutionary War, which is really interesting. I only had one part of my family that came over the later 1800s. Let's see. So anyways, I started digging further to see what my ancestors were actually doing during these big moments of history. And what I found was pretty interesting. It really made me think about where I actually come from, like how I got here, and what history I'm living in right now. So we did 6 different modules, starting with the old world and the new in module 1. And in the 1600s, the Maryland colony was essentially a social experiment in tobacco and religious pluralism. My ancestors, George Simmons, who was my 7th great-grandfather, and grandmother Mary Bird Simmons, were first-generation planters in Anne Arundel County. They acquired some land. I am not sure exactly how, but it might have been through the headright system. And that system, the policy was granted 50 acres for every individual whose passage was financed. I think they had to work it off for a few years first before they received the land, but I'm not really sure if that is how they got their land. But this was a big step in building their legacy, and I can trace my Simmons family up to my dad, Mark Simmons, all the way from George and Mary. So the biggest difference I found between the two worlds was how women were treated under the law. In England, coverture was the standard. It was the idea that a woman's legal identity was totally covered by her husband or her father. But I found in the will of George Simmons from 1679 that he left his land and divided it between all 5 of his children, including his daughters, Sarah and Mary. And in England, everything usually went to the oldest son. And by including his daughters, he gave them dowry power and legal leverage. And they never would have got that back home. And then moving on to module 2, the things that stood out to me were the Dower riots, the witch trials, and the Quakers. And while the Puritans of New England were famously silencing women like Anne Hutchinson for interpreting scripture, I had an ancestor, Maribah Thorne Allen, and she was a Quaker in New Jersey. New Jersey is where Anne Hutchinson was eventually banished to. And I think in New Jersey, the Quakers, they had an easier time with religion, but unfortunately, Anne Hutchinson, I think, was murdered by Native Americans. But I found some records from the Shrewsbury Quaker meetings that named Maribah in some of their spiritual and social, family, religious activities for the Quakers. During the same time in Maryland, my 5th great-grandfather, Abraham Simmons Jr., he left a detailed will, leaving land tracts named Drury's Good Luck and Drury's Adventure to his daughter, Bethridge Simmons. Her mother, Sarah, was named the sole executrix, I think. And that proves that they were practicing femicide rights and acting as independent legal entities. In Maryland, it was much more progressive than some of the other colonies. And by the mid-1700s, laws required a private interview between a judge and a married woman before her husband could sell her land. And it gave her a veto power that women in England didn't have. And then as we move into Module 3 and 4, which I combined, we learned about the Revolutionary War and the domestic sphere and Republican motherhood. So I found an ancestor, Margaretta Adams. She grew up in the middle of all of this in Pennsylvania. Her father, Captain Richard Adams, she ran a tavern in the heart of Pennsylvania, and his father founded Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And Margaretta was actually the same age as the Schuyler sisters, same ones that were in Hamilton. She was, living during that same time. How they sang, how lucky we are to be alive right now. I don't know if it really was that way, but I like that song. So Margaretta, she was in Pennsylvania, though, and the Schuyler sisters were more part of the elite New York scene. Her father, did I already say this? Her father, Captain Richards, he ran a tavern. And taverns back then were the hubs for all the big news happening in the country, we learned. I found the 1778 Oath of Allegiance signed by Richard, her father, proving his loyalty to the Revolution. And while he was in the militia, her father, Margaretta, was a daughter of liberty. And I can imagine that she was serving Liberty tea, which was herbal infusions. And they used those drinks to boycott British imported tea. And I'm sure she was listening to the revolution being debated firsthand, even though, it's not necessarily like the big place of where everything happened. I'm sure that, some famous people, famous forefathers had frequented their tavern at some point in the Revolutionary War. But further south, had a great-great-great-grandmother, Phoebe Belcher Clay. And this was an awful story that I found. I was just horrified. It's something I'd never even heard about, but I'm really glad I know about now. It's really interesting. But in August 1783, the Revolutionary War was technically ending, but the violence on the frontier was still devastating. Phoebe was one of the first white settlers in Virginia. And while her husband and other family members, men in their family, were away, a group of Shawnee attacked their homestead and they killed 2 of her children. There was some newspaper articles and things like that. I don't know if it was like sensationalized, but there was reports that 2 children were scalped. And then her 16-year-old son Ezekiel was kidnapped. And there was one heartbreaking story that Phoebe was begging a passing neighbor for help, but he was too terrified and just kept going. Phoebe ended up running with her remaining kids 6 miles to find her husband and the other men who formed a posse. And they went to go find Ezekiel, but they didn't get him in time. And it was said in newspaper articles that he was burned at the stake. But there is a statue called Agony in Stone near where their old homestead was. And their children's names that were killed were in different memorials near that area as well. Someplace I'd like to visit one day. So I think that is a good case of frontier republicanism. Let's see. In Module 5, we watched a documentary, and it was on the Cherokee. And there was a family, the Ross family, that was a Scottish Cherokee blended family. And they were, pretty elite. They owned a lot of land, and they were involved in politics. And, they ended up having to go on the Trail of Tears, leave their land and everything they built. They tried to fight for the Cherokee people, and just it didn't go and end up well for them. But I had heard stories. I know my mom is a McDaniel, and I had heard stories. I knew that our family had immigrated from Scotland way back then, and I'd heard that there was Cherokee. But, I think I've also heard that a lot of people think that there's some Cherokee ancestry, especially people, whose family were from the South. And also my grandpa, anytime I asked him, he just, would deny it. Anyways, he said, oh, we heard about that, but I don't think there ever was. But there was, when I was looking back at the tree, I found my fourth great grandmother, Susan. It just named her as Cherokee, and I couldn't find any other information. And she had married a McDaniel. And so I did a lot of research, but I ended up putting it together because, I did find something later that her grandson had put in an application to the Goyan Miller Cherokee rolls, but I couldn't find her last name, but it ended up being McDaniel also. They were cousins, so that's kind of why I had such a hard time looking through it. But it turns out that she is the daughter of a really well-known elite Cherokee. His name was Alexander McDaniel. He was half Scottish and half Cherokee. He owned like 160 acres. He was right up there with the Ross family. Their family was, but they ended up leaving when the Indian Removal Act hit in 1830. Susan and her family chose the path of the old settler, and they all moved to Arkansas and decided to maintain their family's autonomy. So they didn't end up going on the Trail of Tears like the Ross family did. But she did identify herself as white on paper. I guess it was really dangerous, and she wanted to protect her children and, what land they did end up getting in Arkansas. And so on the censuses back then, everything said that she was white, but which I guess was strategic assimilation. And she wasn't abandoning her heritage because she was still involved with the Cherokee society and culture, but she was, hiding on paper, basically. The government was very hostile to them. And then I ended up figuring out for sure who she was because her grandson filed an application and he gave a sworn testimony in 1906, that Susan was Cherokee. So finally, I'm going to keep talking about the McDaniel family because they're pretty interesting. They became outlaws. So Susan's son, Amos, they ended up moving to Texas, him and his family, and they bought property in Uvalde. It took them a while to get to Uvalde. They had stopped off in different places in Texas for a couple of years at a time. There's different censuses I found of the McDaniel family, but they ended up settling on the Nueces strip of Texas. So it was kind of a wild time back then. So some of the family, there's newspaper articles. One of my great-great-great-grandfathers, or uncles actually, brother to Amos, his name was George W. McDaniel, and he was a target of a multi-state manhunt in 1898. He went by Santiago, and they called him a shapeshifter, and he would hide in plain sight and pass as a local Tejano to hide from the law. They said that he was known to talk good Mexican to pass, but George was the subject of a multi-state manhunt after escaping from Uvalde County Jail. He was accused of a string of horse thefts, and he was eventually tracked down in Arizona by the controversial Texas Ranger captain turned sheriff George W. Baylor and extradited back to Texas. And then there was Alonzo McDaniel, who was the son of Amos, McDaniel, and he was a notorious horse thief and escape artist, and Emmett was famous for sensational jailbreaks. In one of his many escapes, he fled the Florence penitentiary in a prison motor car with a condemned murderer. And when he was finally captured in August 1926, after a high-stakes chase through the Caballo Mountains, newspapers referred to his associates as the McDaniel Gang. And their exploits were known to be a family affair. And from what I've read, that these outlaw tendencies were often a response to the Compromise of 1850 and the Mexican-American War. And they were just living in a lawless, disputed zone. And, just they viewed outrunning posses and escaping jails as a testament to their survival skills. But in conclusion, looking back from 1679 to 1926 and what I learned in U.S. history, and, first of all, I'm really glad I took this class, because I don't think I would have ever put together some of these stories or did all this research to find out more about these ancestors if I wasn't learning this history. And, like I said in the beginning, it just really kind of made me think more about where I came from and how I got here. And I was born and raised in Oregon. I didn't even really know that I had family that lived in Texas. I had kind of heard about Arizona, but not ever really, and maybe New Mexico, but not really Texas. So, moving here 7 or 8 years ago, it's kind of cool to see that there was family history here. And now I can go and maybe visit these places and see where some of those McDaniels went and were causing all this trouble. But from George Simmons breaking tradition to giving his daughter's land, to Phoebe Clay running 6 miles to save her kids, and Susan McDaniel hiding her identity, and the McDaniel Gang outrunning the Texas Rangers, my ancestors seemed like they were always negotiating their own versions of freedom. And, they just kind of lived by their own rules. And I think they were always kind of a little bit ahead of, the most terrible, except for Phoebe, but, some of the most horrible things in history, like the Trail of Tears. And I didn't really talk about the Civil War, but I did have ancestors I found that lived right on the borders of Virginia. I had one set of family on one side of Virginia and another set right on the other side of Virginia. So that was pretty interesting. But I don't know, there's a lot of information. I had to really cut it down a lot. So there's a lot I wanted to say. And I was really afraid that I was going to forget things, which I did, I'm pretty sure. But anyways, I thank you for listening to my presentation. Thank you for, teaching me. And this was a really interesting class, and I am so glad I took it. Cheers. Bye-bye.